Hey, it's Bobby from New Jersey, and this is a slightly different video than I've been putting out recently. I gave this talk to my homebrew club, the Garden State Homebrewers, at a meeting last week to about 20 people, and it was well received. So I thought I would just duplicate it in a video for my YouTube channel and hopefully reach several more people and help somebody out that needs to hear this. Water, water everywhere, and some of it stinks for brewing. Simplified brewing water primer for lay brewers. Now, that's not a typo for lazy brewers. I'm not saying lazy. I just mean homebrewers that really are not interested in getting a chemistry degree for every aspect of their brewing process. Just getting the information that you really need to know to make good decisions about your beer ingredients. So why should you care? Water that is safe to drink and tastes pretty good to drink does not always make good beer. You'll hear people say the opposite of that. They'll say things like, oh, if it tastes good, it's probably good to brew with. I don't agree with that at all. The only thing I would agree with is the complete opposite, is that water that tastes horrible to drink will probably make horrible beer. That could be true, but safe and tasty drinking water does not always correlate to good beer. Now, any given water source that you might find available, whether it be well water, your municipal tap water, bottled spring water, distilled, reverse osmosis, whatever it may be, wherever you get that particular water, it will inherently be suitable for a particular style or color of beer. We won't really know what style or color it is ideal for, but we do know that it cannot be ideal for all of the different colors and styles of beer simultaneously. There is no one water source that's perfect for every style. Various ions or salts that are dissolved in that water are responsible for favorable or ideal mash pH. We'll get into specifics about mash pH in a minute. It also affects fermentation, whether malty or bitter flavors are accentuated, and then also the overall mouthfeel in a beer. So those are sort of the positive aspects of things that you're trying to accentuate. But the other issue is that water can also cause off flavors, such as astringency, which is sort of that puckering over bitter quality, or you might say that it's tannic. The tannin level of the beer is a little bit too high, almost like a slightly over-extracted tea. It's just kind of this drying sensation that is not derived from hop bitterness. You could have minerality. It literally tastes like there's chalk in the water. The other one is metallic. There are some elements that can be in the water, like iron. And then another one that's extremely common is chlorophenols, which it ends up being like a medicinal flavor or aroma. Something like when you open up a Band-Aid, you get this plasticky kind of aroma. And all of these can be attributed to an unsuitable water supply. Let's talk about some strategies that you can consider. And there's really just two of them. The first one would be to get your tap water tested, and then you would learn to manipulate that water as necessary. I would say this is the lesser reliable way of doing it, because if you're getting your tap water from a municipal supplier, they will change their source of water. So they might be sourcing surface water or out of a reservoir for part of the year and then switch to a well. And they also may be sourcing water from adjacent supplies in the area. So the test you get on your tap water at any given time is really just a time capsule or a snapshot in time. And in order to know for sure what is in your water, you have to get your water tested on a regular basis, or at least until you can verify that it doesn't change all that much, either seasonally over the course of a couple of years. So the other method is to source distilled water or reverse osmosis water from a local dispenser. Or you can do it at home with the RO system installed, like under your kitchen sink, or you might have one that's portable that you just hook into a hose bib for when you need to collect brewing water. Now, there are a couple of advantages to having your own system. You can always control when the filters get replaced, and you don't have to wonder how long everything's been sitting around between servicing, and you can be relatively sure that there's like no mold growing in your system, as opposed to the machines that are out there. I don't know what the maintenance schedule would look like. And then if the system breaks down, I mean, you might go to buy the water from your local place and the machine is down and your brewing plans are now foiled. So I'd much prefer installing your own RO system at home. And the question of costs is, it's pretty reasonable given the fact that you don't have to spend time and gas to go pick up water. You can make it at home. And if you brew often enough, you could probably see a payback in about a year or so. And you could probably talk yourself into using the RO water that you make at home for other purposes, like running it to your ice maker in the refrigerator. When you have RO or distilled water at your disposal, you're going to most likely modify that water a bit via some sort of recipe from a known profile. And by known profile, I mean that RO and distilled water essentially is completely devoid of ions or salts. So you always know where you're starting from, as opposed to when you have a sort of variable tap water source. Assuming you don't want to get distilled or RO water, you want to work with what you have, whether you get it tested or not, one of the most important things you can do is to remove the chlorine or chloramine that gets added to that water. Now, it is added by your municipal water supplier to keep the water sanitary, keep bacteria down, and the result of that being in your brewing water is that it adds a medicinal flavor to your beer. I talked about the Band-Aid, plasticky aroma and flavor. Removing it's very cheap. There are a couple different ways to go about it. If you run through a simple carbon filter, you have to just run it really slowly because it needs contact time. It's a pretty small amount of activated carbon, and it will absorb chlorine and chloramines effectively, but you have to run it slower than you think. So it's like a trickle. It would, you should really let it run very slowly through there and just give yourself time to collect that water. You can't do it right before you want to brew. Now, if you have chlorine in the water, you can just fill up your brew kettle the night before and let it sort of off gas. It does that pretty readily at room temperature. The other alternative is to use metabisulfite, otherwise known as Campden tablets. If you add that to a water that has chlorine or chloramine in it, it basically renders it ineffective, and it will get rid of that problem for you. One Campden tablet will treat about 20 gallons, so if you're only heating up 5, cut it into fourths and then crush it up into a powder. Now, in a previous slide, I talked about testing your tap water so that you know what's in it. And although I discourage that as the path forward, I did want to mention how you would do that. People will think that they can go to their water supplier and ask for a report, and they're only required to test for chemicals and microbes and things that can get their customers sick. So they're really trying to satisfy the health authorities on the safety of the water rather than what its suitability is for brewing with. So the more reliable way to get the exact data that we need as brewers is to send about 8 ounces of water in a water bottle to wardlab.com, and you can shop through all of the different water tests that they have. I have listed on this slide the specific ions that we need data on, so you can kind of like make sure that the test that you order has that. At least the time when I was looking, the W4 test, it was one of the cheapest tests that had everything we needed. I think it was $27.50, pretty reasonable for getting all of this information. And you send a check and your email address along with that water sample. A couple days later, you'll get an email with a breakdown of all these values. Now, I did want to say, even though $27.50 is pretty cheap for the test, like I said, if you have to do the test 3 times a year or once a year even, that money is probably better spent on funding an RO water filter system, specifically because you can get them for about $100. Now, following up with a display of what the results page looks like, I think it's a PDF file that you can open up that they send you in your email. And you'll see the red arrows are pointing to the ions that we actually care about the most: sodium, calcium, magnesium, sulfate, chloride, and total alkalinity. They also give you the bicarbonate level, which if you're using a software calculator, either of those values can be added, and you just have to make sure that you're putting it in the correct fields. Now, mash pH is extremely important. If you're an all grain brewer and you're not caring for your mash pH or even thinking about it, then this is the spot in this talk where you should pay close attention, because it has the opportunity of improving your beer quite a bit. I do see a lot of people pushing back on caring about mash pH and saying things like, I don't care about mash pH and my beer is perfectly fine. I'm glad that you like your beer and that the beer is perfectly fine, but it could be finer. You will like it more and you'll be better at brewing a wider range of styles if you care about mash pH. And I'm not even suggesting that you need to go out and buy a pH meter to do this. And I'll try to make it so you understand why it's important and how it works. Even if you don't understand how it works after I explain it, we're going to talk about how to effectively make it work in your brewing without understanding it. Water in general is basic, which means it's on the base side of the pH spectrum. Neutral pH would be like 7.0, and then as you go above that, you can say that's a liquid or is more basic. And the other thing that you could say is that dark malts that you would use in your mash are acidic. So those are kind of the push and pull of the mash, is that water comes in on the base side of the spectrum and darker malts comes in as the acidic side, and they kind of push each other around a bit. Now, figuring out where your mash pH is going to land can be extremely complicated. You know, the chemistry involved is over my head, and I cheat by using software that is driven by formulas created by smarter people. The point is that you can see this play out when you brew. If you do measure your pH and you find it to be in a favorable or unfavorable range, you can prove it to yourself that it matters when you taste the beer, right? If you've mashed outside of the ideal zone and it tastes crappy, then you know that it matters. Now, a mash pH over 5.6 can lead to astringency problems, and maybe it's more like 5.8 or 6.0. As you go up, it becomes more and more likely to cause a problem. And one of the reasons this is that as you get to extreme ends of the pH spectrum, either very acidic or very basic, the liquid becomes more of a solvent or a more effective solvent. So it is very effective at breaking down the organics. So if you think about all of the grain husks that are in your grain bill and the fact that they are soaking in a very effective solvent, you can understand why beers that are mashed at a very high pH are often considered to have a husky flavor, or, you know, that astringency, like an over-extracted tea. That happens because the grain husks are getting liquefied and broken down, and a lot of those compounds are leaching out into your wort. So a high mash pH will probably lead to some astringency problems. Now, we can continue to generalize a little bit by showing you what would happen pH-wise if we were to start with either pure distilled water or RO water, where we don't add any salts or acids. Now, let's start with the left-hand side of the graphic. We're talking about a pH spectrum from acidic to basic. And if we were to make a mash with dark roasted malts and distilled or RO water, the pH is going to get dragged down to somewhere in the 4.8 to 5.3 range. So you can see the darker roasted malts have a lot of acidity and just sort of lands the mash pH lower. Now on the right-hand side, using extremely pale base malts like all Pilsner malt, you know, targeting something like an American light lager or something like a German Helles or Pilsner, that mash would settle in a bit higher. You'd end up at 5.6 to 6.0, and the ideal range is somewhere from 5.1 to 5.5. Now, we can argue that there's really nothing terribly wrong with 4.8 or 4.9 or 5.6. You know, when you're straddling sort of the limits of that acceptable range, you know, the odds of it creating a terrible beer is pretty low. But as you get further and further below or above that, the likelihood goes up. And I would argue that a high pH during the mash is the worse of two evils, because you get that breakdown of the husks, and that's where that astringent flavor comes from. I would say that as a beer judge, I've tasted many more astringent beers than I did acidic tart beers. Now, this example was really just using distilled or RO water that has no modifications to it. But regardless of where the water came from, you can see that there really is no water supply that's ideal for both a really dark stout and a really pale Pilsner without doing some modifications to it. All right, so let's say that you only care about correcting your mash pH using RO or distilled water as your source. The first thing you could do is using your favorite brewing software, your recipe design software. You can select distilled water as your source, and when it comes to inputting how much calcium and sodium and so on, you're just going to put 0 in there unless they already have a distilled or RO water profile as one of the selectable source water profiles. Essentially, most of your software is going to predict what the mash pH is going to be. And the convenient thing there is that it's already factoring in the acidity of the grain bill that you've already entered, or maybe you got a recipe off the cloud or something. It could be very predictive, and it's pretty accurate. All of the software is pretty good with that. Shoot for the middle, because even if the prediction is a little bit off plus or minus, at least you're not going to be in the 5.8 or 6.0 area anymore. Generally, you're going to be acidifying your strike water for your mash. And then if you're not really interested in learning how to exploit software and use its water calculators, then you can use the rule of thumb that I have on the next slide. Okay, this is a simple rule of thumb chart for adding 88% lactic acid to your strike water to prevent high pH problems. I broke this down into 3 different addition categories, and it's based on beer color ranges. So let's do the first block on the left. This is either your super pale yellow to golden color. This is where most of your base malt is either just two-row brewer's malt or a Pilsner, or maybe 100% pale malt, something like that, but maxing out at golden. Now, this is going to require the most amount of acid because it is the least acidic malt. So let's say you're going to have 8 gallons of strike water in your mash tun, and you're going to add the 0.75 mils per gallon. Then you're going to have 6 mils total of lactic acid in that strike water. And you're going to measure that with a small, like 10 mil syringe. You can get these long blunt tip needles for syringes, and it's convenient to be able to dip that down into your bottle of lactic acid and suck up exactly how much you need. Okay, the next category is copper to light brown. If you're on the lighter side of that, in the copper area, you can use 0.5 ml per gallon. And then if you're getting into the light brown, sort of dark caramel color there, you're going to go 0.25 mils per gallon. When you get into your dark brown to black, that would be like porters and stouts, the dark roasted grains that go into that will bring enough acidity that you really don't need to add any lactic. The other thing I'll say is that if you're going to fly sparge your mash, that is, continually add sparge water while you're running off your wort into a boil kettle, you should also acidify your sparge water at the same rates that are listed here. And that is to help prevent the mash pH from drifting upward as you sparge further and further. If you are just blindly using your tap water or your well water, you will also benefit from acidifying your mash. Per this rule of thumb, you may need more acid than this chart suggests, but doing this minimal level of addition will absolutely make a positive impact on your mash pH. It just might not be quite enough. It's certainly better than not adding any lactic. Okay, so aside from pH, flavor is also at stake. I want to just be clear that this is getting into a little bit more detail that is very much secondary to the mash pH. So you don't necessarily have to do this. It's kind of completing the thought. being pragmatic about your water chemistry without absolutely having to know everything about it. The chloride to sulfate ratio will also determine the overall balance of the beer, whether it be accentuated in the malty position or more brightly bitter. So that is to say that the more sulfate you have, the more bright or clean the bitterness profile. You can get some bite or minerality out of it. Whereas if you accentuate the chloride, it will give you a more soft, malty character to it. It adds a little bit of mouthfeel to the beer. But it should be noted that the effect of this chloride to sulfate balance is often exaggerated, in my opinion. It's subtle, so I think if you don't really want to get too deep into water, that this is the one thing that could probably be ignored. So this one is a little bit of extra information that you might not really need to know, but we're going to talk about ideal ranges of all of these different salts that you would find on a water report, and we can easily manipulate these with some simple salt additions to the strike water. The first thing is that a minimum of 50 ppm of total calcium should be present in the mash for good enzyme function. Now, that is a rule of thumb that is repeated in a lot of literature, and I have had successful mashes in the 20 ppm range. You can have poor yeast health if it's really low, and you could be left with some hazy beer. Good calcium levels help to flocculate the finer particles in the beer. Magnesium is another one. Yeast use it as a nutrient. And the thing, though, is that you really don't have to add magnesium because there is some magnesium in the malts that will get extracted during the mash. 10 to 30 ppm is ideal, and I do believe you get at least 10 out of most mashes just from the grain itself. But adding a little bit of magnesium is a good idea as well. Now, if you go off the deep end and add too much, it could be bitter tasting, and you could also have like a laxative effect. Sulfate, we talked a little bit about. It accentuates bitterness. If you're extremely low, then the hop bitterness can be a little bit dull. It was pretty common for West Coast IPAs to be pretty cranked on the sulfate side, 150 to 350 ppm for like a really like bitter West Coast IPA. Chloride is also a flavor accentuator, but like I said, it's kind of a rounding effect. It adds fullness and does the opposite of what high sulfate does. And then sodium, just like why sodium goes into most food, is that it's a flavor booster. Go higher than 200 ppm and it will taste salty. The one beer style where that's acceptable is a Goza. So let's move on to the rule of thumb slide. All right, assuming distilled or RO water, you're going to shop for a couple of different salts. Gypsum, which is calcium sulfate, you can get that at a homebrew shop. Calcium chloride, also at a homebrew shop. The Epsom salt or magnesium sulfate, get it in the grocery store or pharmacy. Just make sure that there's no fragrances added. A lot of people use these as like bath salts, so you just want to make sure that the ingredients are pure magnesium sulfate. And then sodium chloride, you can get canning salt or just non-iodized table salt. I broke it into 3 columns, just like the mash pH. If you want the beer to be neutral, not malty accentuated or bitter accentuated, you're going to stick with the neutral right down the center. And this is per gallon of strike water, just like the acid addition. So 1/8 of a gram of Epsom salt, 1/8 of a gram of table salt. And you'll notice that those 2 additions are the same across all 3 profiles. So you can just normalize on that amount for Epsom and table salt. And then the balanced profile will have 1/2 gram of gypsum and 1/2 gram of calcium chloride, again, per gallon of strike water. Moving to the left, where we want sort of a malty or softer profile, such as within hazy IPAs or NEPAs, you're going to back off on your gypsum contribution down to 1/4 of a gram, and then increase your calcium chloride to 3/4 of a gram. And then on the bitter accentuated for like a West Coast IPA, you do the exact opposite. You go up in gypsum, 3/4 of a gram of gypsum, and down to 1/4 of a gram of calcium chloride. So you're just kind of flip-flopping the amount per gallon there. Now, I want to be very clear that these rule of thumb additions are specifically only for distilled or RO water sources, and you should not add anything to water that you don't know its salt concentration. So, in summary, if you're overwhelmed by any of this stuff, just get yourself some RO or distilled water and refer to slide 9. That is the bare minimum, and it will noticeably improve your beer across the board. One of the biggest off flavors I get as a beer judge is astringency. It's the off flavor checkbox that I check the most, but $3 for a little bottle of 88% lactic acid is so cheap that you have nothing to lose. And I would reiterate the fact that if you are a big fan of very pale beers, then this is going to impact your beer quality even more than somebody who already brews stouts where they didn't really need the acid in the first place. Give it a shot and let me know how it goes. Thanks.